Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for attending our May Marston lecture. And those who are joining us online through our stream option, I want to say hello. We are currently in business. I got to say we were having a little technical difficulties, but we're not. So, this is awesome. All right. Stopped me in my tracks. Okay, good. So we are good. Is this the first page? All right. So we are ready to get started, and we first will have a welcome by Provost Hartley.
So good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. And again, thank you for those of you who are watching us online. Thank you for being here as well. It is really a joy to be with you this afternoon for this annual, our 2022 installment of the Marston Lecture. Although I am here in my second year as provost at SPU. Because of the unusual circumstances of last year, I'm having the opportunity this year to get to experience many of the traditions that are important in this institution. And although the job that I'm in is very often one in which I'm thinking about the present and the future, opportunities like this give me an opportunity to pause and think about the past for a moment, and in particular to learn a little bit more about the past of this particular institution and the way that God has been using it in this place for more than 130 years. So, as you can see, the May Marston Professorship in Classics, along with the corresponding annual lecture, it was actually established in 1993 in order to honor the contribution of Dr. May Marston to Christian higher education. Here's a photo of her. And many of the details of my short introduction tonight are borrowed from the introductory remarks given by Samuel Dunn, who was then the Vice President for Academic Affairs back in 1993 during the inaugural lecture. So, Dr. Marston attended high school in what was then called Seattle Seminary during its first year of operation and went on to graduate in 1898. She then went on to earn her bachelor's degree at Greenville College in Illinois, a sister institution in the Free Methodist tradition, and then earned her master's degree from the University of Washington. Dr. Marston returned to Seattle Seminary in 1902 and quickly established herself as a faculty leader. Among other accomplishments, she was a member of the committee that in 1915 proposed changing the name of the institution to Seattle Pacific College. Dr. Marston taught many subjects during her career, principally English and German, but also Latin, Greek, and French, accomplishments that I, as a linguist, find both impressive and daunting. She was known as a methodical professor who also had a wonderful sense of humor, a compassionate heart, and a strong faith in Jesus Christ. She retired in 1959, having served as a professor for 55 years, the longest tenure, I think, still to this day in SPU's history. As I said, the May Marston Professorship was made possible by a donor gift back in 1993. The professorship is awarded to a full-time tenured or tenure-track faculty member selected by the president of the university upon nomination by the chief academic officer, and it provides that the holder shall devote part of her or his duties to the teaching of courses in classics. So in a moment, Dr. Copeland is going to come and introduce our current holder of the professorship and the person giving the lecture today. But before she does that, would you please just join me in a quick opening word of prayer? Lord God, we are grateful for the life of Dr. May Marston and her legacy here at Seattle Pacific University, the way that she for many, many years carried out her calling in this place. And we thank you for that legacy that she has left behind, reminding us of the importance of the work of study in the fields that she taught and other fields that make up the discipline of classics. God, we thank you for Dr. Ewald and his continued faithfulness in this professorship as well. And we thank you for the very interesting topic that he will present to us today. We ask that you give him clarity of thought. We ask that the technology will work, and we thank you for this opportunity to be together in this time and space. And we pray these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Provost Hartley, for welcoming us to Dr. Ewald's 17th May Marston Lecture. Just a reminder, the annual Marston Lecture at Seattle Pacific University is presented by the faculty member appointed to the May Marston Professorship, named in honor of May Marston. A bulletin from October 1958, when we were called Seattle Pacific College, stated about Dr. Marston that while the length of her service will seldom be excelled, it is not for this that we primarily wish to honor her. Instead, we pay tribute to the quality of her work. She was at once deadly serious about the business of education, but not so serious as to prevent the sudden, sharp thrust of humor that makes moral earnestness palatable. Any college would be richly blessed to be the inheritor of a half-century of such devoted service as Dr. Marston has given to SPC. What an honor it is for the professor who gets to live out the legacy of such a remarkable human. Which brings me to introduce Dr. Owen Ewald, our May Marston professor. Dr. Ewald is an associate professor of classics at SBU. Over the past 20 years, he has taught Latin, Greek, ancient literature in translation, art history, and ancient history. He has taught in the University Scholars Program since 2008. The languages he can read include ancient Greek, Latin, French, German, Sanskrit, and English. His scholarship includes articles on aesthetics, historiography, poetics, and topography, as well as translations. As Mark Zuckerberg transitions us into the metaverse era, aren't you curious to hear Dr. Ewald speak today on classics and social media? Yes, you are. Please give a round of applause for our colleague and professor to many, I see his students here, Dr. Ewald. Thank you.
Thank you, Radine and Laura, Provost and Assistant Provost, for those lovely introductions. And thank you all for coming. I hope also everybody can hear me. Good, good. Okay. So, in this talk, I'm going to focus on the creations and curations of classic students, memes, red pill communities, and the dark academia aesthetic. I need to do a disclaimer about educational use, since I will be showing such items as a Confederate battle flag and a couple of quotes from rather terrible people. And I need to clarify that I'm not endorsing or promoting everything I show. First, I should define the word meme. According to sociologist Alice Marwick, and yes, she uses all small letters, a meme is a string of reappropriated words and images. Marwick traces the idea back to Richard Dawkins, who attempted to use biological terms to describe the spread of human culture in the 1970s. Dawkins wrote, "Memes propagate themselves by leaping from brain to brain, or screen to screen, as we might now say." I even had a student who enrolled in New Testament Greek, not because of the Bible, but because I advertised it with a meme about the internet's favorite Shiba Inu dog, affectionately nicknamed Doge, shown here. This is the poster and a good look at Doge. The student even brought up the currency Dogecoin in a class discussion of ancient money. At a recent academic conference held online, One archaeologist illustrated his points with memes. Since the archaeologist was from Poland, I was unfamiliar with some of the memes, but I still got most of the jokes. And in the discussion period, many of the conference participants expressed appreciation for his use of humor in this unfamiliar, rather disembodied format. Before the pandemic, at an in-person academic conference, when those were a thing, a Canadian professor and I opened our laptops to show one another the memes we had used in teaching ancient history courses. And his memes were much more on point than mine. Okay. And while there are dozens of classics-related memes to choose from, I'm going to focus on 2 Instagram accounts that I follow and 1 inactive Twitter account. And I'm going to emphasize the lighter side. First, Gilgamesh of Uruk memes on Instagram. He's an undergraduate studying history at St. Andrews University in Scotland, where some of our faculty did their doctoral work. A recurrent theme is the difficulty of making a living if he should go on for his doctorate in archaeology, and some of his posts are pessimistic or doom memes. Also, like all history majors at most colleges, he's had to take courses in non-Western history, so a lot of his recent memes reflect East Asian or Central American contexts. Here are a couple posts from his account, and only one is a career doom meme. It's a variation or elaboration of the Russian proverb, "We have already stepped on that rake." Okay. So undergraduate and graduate versions. Okay. The second refers to the mythological story of Aeolus, god of the winds. Those of you who've read the Aeneid are familiar with him, or the Odyssey. He gave Odysseus and his crew a bag full of winds so that the winds would stay in the bag while they were sailing. But the crew thought that the bag contained treasure, so they opened it up with disastrous results. This meme from the Nickelodeon cartoon character SpongeBob captures the moment of opening the bag and letting out all the winds at once. Second, I'll introduce the Instagram account, Lars the Etruscan. Okay, he's a recent graduate of Seattle Pacific, and he started creating memes when he took my ancient history course on Greece and Rome. I would usually show some memes during the short break halfway through the 2-hour class to get everyone to relax a bit. Well, some of you know who he is. I will refer to him as Larth, a typical name of a male Etruscan. And if you're not familiar with the Etruscans, they were an ethnic group in northern Italy for whom Queen Anne's own Etruria Street is named. Etruria is the region where they lived. And here are a couple posts from his account. One of them's a meme featuring, on the left, a triple standoff, but among armed men. This meme compares the triple standoff to the successors of Alexander the Great, who divided his empire and immediately began fighting over it the minute Alexander died. The second is a comparison I did in class between the actor Owen Wilson and a mosaic of Christ in late antique Britain. Just look at the chin. Okay. This also provoked a good discussion about whether this is sort of an early example of people insisting that Jesus was white. But I want to, let's say, to show you that this is a part of a larger trend in Christianity to enculturate the gospel story within its own culture. That is, to populate the Christian story with people who look like the worshipers, the people who are being preached to, the people who are being evangelized. Here's some more contemporary examples. In Ethiopia, Jesus and his disciples look Ethiopian. In Japan, Jesus and his disciples look Japanese. So in Britain, Jesus looks British. Lars hasn't posted much lately since he's now discerning a monastic vocation while working for a service organization in New York City, but I was very appreciative of his efforts during my class to help students and faculty connect. Okay. Elsewhere in the world, Elena Gomez, a student at the University of Iowa, made a Twitter account for Professor Hannah Chulik-Baird's Classics 102 class, The World of Rome. Chulik-Baird comments, "Her memes were so on point," end quote. And here are some images from her Twitter account. The first one uses images of the comedian John Mulaney to describe the plot of Seneca's tragedy Thyestes. This tragedy treats a kin murder plot from ancient Greece to illustrate the pervasive kin murder of the early Roman Empire. Okay, we have Thyestes serving his nephews to his brother as food, okay, and the Emperor Nero in the Roman Empire had his own mother assassinated. Okay. The second image, which is not strictly a meme, on the right here, shows Elena's flashcards of keywords for her class. The keyword here is ambition, or ambitio in Latin, which literally means going around to various people, seeking their votes and political support. Before there were those annoying political robocalls, candidates had to wear out shoe leather or sandal leather seeking support. What I like about this image is that it shows her studying and even suggests a learning strategy to her fellow students. The emphasis is on learning rather than on self-promotion. We'll get back here. Okay, there we go. Why is this happening? It's fun to create or spread memes that others will recognize. It's near simultaneous communication with your peer group and with your instructors. Lars the Etruscan started his account partly as a way to show his love for his academic discipline to his fellow students. Elena Gomez's Twitter account says facetiously, "In it for the extra credit," though she has put in way more work than necessary. Finally, it's a way to trick yourself into studying. Even the act of typing the name of an historical figure or literary character solidifies it in your memory. But now I want to look at a way that classics has played a role in a far less constructive pursuit, the building of so-called red pill communities. The rise of the alt-right in North America and in Europe has been one of the most frightening developments of recent years. A Polish-American friend said to me recently, "We Middle Europeans have seen this movie before, and we know how it ends." He did not even need to add, "in World War." But I hope that there's still time to turn back. The alt-right likes to use a scene from the film The Matrix as a guiding metaphor. For those of you who have not seen the film, the character Morpheus, shown here, played by Lawrence Fishburne, offers the character Neo a choice between reality, represented by a red pill, and a sleep of illusion, represented by a blue pill. Note that the political meanings of those colors had not yet been popularized. Moreover, some interpretations of the film see the pill choice not as an allegory for politics, but as an allegory for being transgender. The red pill is the true gender, while the blue pill is the gender identity assigned at birth. The transgender reading of the allegory is reinforced by the fact that the filmmakers, the Wachowski siblings, both changed gender from male to female sometime after the film. And this allegory is offered as an interpretation in passing in the new movie Matrix Resurrections, the fourth movie in the franchise. But in alt-right discourse, the red pill means their ideas and frames, while the blue pill means the ideas and frames of their opponents. Some red pillars have participated at alt-right events, such as the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, shown here on the right, or Identity of Europa meetups like the one on Queen Anne Hill, profiled in the Stranger newspaper. Their connection to classics is tenuous, but some adopt classical pseudonyms, pretend to follow the ancient philosophy of Stoicism, or claim to model their lives on classical literature. For example, Mussonius Rufus was the name of an ancient Stoic philosopher from the 1st century CE. This philosopher wrote 2 treatises arguing that women should become Stoic philosophers. He also taught Stoic philosophy to the formerly enslaved Epictetus, whose philosophical writings influenced the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, whom we'll see shortly. But the name Mussonius Rufus was adopted, or maybe stolen, by the founder of the neo-Confederate website Identity Dixie and host of the podcast Rebel Yell, a Southern nationalist podcast of the alt-right. And that's the full title. He also helped publicize and promote the Unite the Right rally. To unpack this irony, the neo-Confederate Mussonius Rufus would disagree with the philosopher Mussonius Rufus on the education of the formerly enslaved and on women having the same abilities as men. Curtis Dozier, a professor of classics at Vassar, has an entire list of pseudonyms and avatars on his blog Pharos, Greek for lighthouse, including this one. And more examples can be found in Donna Zuckerberg's book, Not All Dead White Men. And yes, she's Mark's sister. Okay. One other odd thing is that many red pill forums and reading lists recommend the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Zuckerberg remarks on how red pillars prefer later Stoic philosophy and their thoughts about ethics rather than about logic or physics. Marcus Aurelius writes in Greek in the late 2nd century CE, almost at the end of the Stoic tradition, and with influence from other philosophical schools. Nevertheless, he has the advantage of being complete rather than in wretched fragments, and widely available in translation rather than requiring 2 years of college-level Greek. Marcus Aurelius' Meditations are mined for advice on character, or a thread on Red Pill Books includes the Meditations for advice on how to be a man, even though very little in the work is gender-specific. Older translations use man for the Greek word anthropos, human as opposed to animal. The word's grammatically masculine because the default setting for people in ancient Greek is masculine, or because roles and jobs are masculine. But person is probably the most appropriate translation into modern English. But the observation about the lack of gender specificity in the Meditations does not come from me, but from a woman, the accomplished local poet Roberta Olson, with whom I read through a substantial portion of the Meditations in Greek. Here's an example of a typical thought from the Meditations. Quote, "Early in the morning, you should say to yourself, I will meet people who are too much, unpleasant, aggressive, tricky, malicious, or antisocial. All these features have turned out in them due to their ignorance of good and evil." At the risk of being obvious, Aurelius talks in a rather abstract way about people in general, of all genders, and not how his wife, the Empress Faustina, should make him breakfast. This quote also shows his pessimistic view of humanity. On a bad day, comments the Roman historian Colin Wells, he sounds like Eeyore from A.A. Milne's Winnie the Pooh series. I cannot argue that the ancient Stoics were progressive by modern standards. While Stoics believed that every human being is capable of philosophy, they did not argue or work for the abolition of slavery or for legal equality of women with men. But to make ancient Stoics less egalitarian than they actually were seems like a pronounced failure in red pill discourse. If they have not sworn off romantic relationships altogether, many red pill men seek casual sexual encounters as quote-unquote pickup artists. As pickup artists, they overvalue and misread the Roman poet Ovid, who wrote an infamous work about how to arrange such encounters called the Ars Amatoria, sometimes translated as the art of love, or perhaps better, the lover's skill. And they see Ovid as a kindred spirit. A red pillar named Peter Burns comments, the Ars Amatoria is quite red pill. Women of 2,000 years ago and from very conservative cultures had the same vices that women of today have, even though the work is about the vices of men as well as the vices of women. What the red pill men have in common with Ovid is a view of men as superior to women and a goal of transgressing women's boundaries. Here's an example of a pickup moment in Ovid, and again, I don't endorse this or recommend it as relationship advice. Okay. Quote, "Do not let the contest of noble knights get away from you. The Circus Maximus, full of people, has many opportunities. And as it happens, if some dust by chance should fall into the girl's lap, your fingers would have to brush it off. Or if there's no dust, still brush away nothing. Let any reason be fit for your service. If the hems of her cloak are lying on the ground, gather them and carefully pick them up from the unclean dirt. Immediately, if the girl allows, her ankles will turn out to be visible to your eyes." End quote. Creepy? Yes, but not necessarily serious, unless you are red pill. Red pill readers would take the desirability of crowds at face value as increasing their odds for meeting women. They would also recommend invading women's personal space, as Ovid's lover does, even though red pillars emphasize much more unrequested kisses. Finally, they would also approve of looking at the woman's ankles as a way of extrapolating the shape of the rest of her body and ranking her on a 10-point scale. But what the red pill men miss is a lot of ambiguous features of Ovid, pointed out by Zuckerberg and others. First, he's being overly technical about human interactions, as one might be technical about horse training or aqueduct building. Richard Tarrant called the Ars Amatoria insanely systematic. Baylor professor Julia Hajduk, in her introduction to her translation of this work, points out how absurd the idea of a technical manual for relationships is. How Ovid's work is a satire in its very premise. Again, a subtlety that red pillars miss. Second, Ovid discusses the idea of service, which is my rough translation of the Latin word officium, service or duty, the ancestor of our word office. Usually, services in Roman culture are performed by men for their political allies or ideally for the state, as in Cicero's work De Officiis, on services or on duties, a work largely based on real Stoic philosophy. But in gender relations, the power gap between men and women in ancient Rome was enormous. The idea of a man performing service for a woman is more like a metaphor or a cosplay that does not change any underlying social or political realities. Red pill men would actually see the idea of service from a man toward a woman as being submissive or a distraction from the goal of magnifying one's own status and power. Moreover, many features of Ovid's text violate Roman laws of his day, specifically laws promoted by the Emperor Augustus. Ovid claims that he's not teaching how to seduce married women, which was newly outlawed under civil law by the Emperor Augustus, but rather how to get free sex from prostitutes, which is obviously not serious. Ovid's lover's unmarried, and Augustus instituted legal and financial penalties for celibacy, for remaining unmarried into middle age, in order to promote the birth of more children. The scene quoted above takes place at events arranged by the emperor, but he also passed laws to force women and men to sit in separate areas at public events. As if this was not enough, the poem, The Lover's Skill, the Ars Amatoria, motivated the Emperor Augustus to exile Ovid from Rome to the town of Tomis on what's now Romania's Black Sea coast. Red pill readers are unaware of the legal and political implications of Ovid's text, just as they often seem to ignore their own country's laws against assault or improbably advocate the repeal of the 19th Amendment of the US Constitution, which specifies that women have the right to vote. Finally, the incident may be modeled on an anecdote about the Roman general Sulla that appears in Plutarch's Life of Sulla, which I'll read here. A few days later, there was a gladiatorial show. In those days, men and women could still mingle in theaters and were not segregated into different areas. And there happened to be sitting near Sulla a good-looking, high-born woman named Valeria, who was the daughter of Messala and sister of the orator Hortensius. Coincidentally, she had just been divorced from her husband. As she walked past Sulla on the row behind him, she rested her hand on him and pulled a piece of fluff off his toga before carrying on to her own seat. Sulla looked on her in surprise, and she said, "Don't worry, Imperator. I just want to have a piece of your good fortune for myself." Sulla liked her remark and was clearly intrigued, since he sent someone off to make discreet inquiries about who she was. In the end, they became formally betrothed. Despite how well Sulla comes off in this anecdote, Plutarch goes on to mention that Sulla, even after his marriage to the charming Valeria, continues to visit prostitutes of both genders. This incident in Plutarch is closer, let's say, to a meet cute than Ovid's service, and note that the gender of the one doing the touching has a completely different cultural meaning. A woman touching a man's clothing is coded as a gesture of admiration rather than a prelude to acquiring him. But the most important thing for Roman readers is that the man in the anecdote is Sulla, who was in the opposite political faction from Augustus and his adoptive father Julius Caesar. Sulla ordered the murders of tens of thousands of his political opponents, in contrast to Augustus's policy of pardoning his enemies if they surrendered. I've called, in other talks, Sulla the Voldemort of Roman politics. Okay. So it's transgressive to make Sulla look good or to recommend behaving like him and meeting women at sporting events in violation of several of Augustus's laws. Finally, the audience for Ovid's poem is unclear. If the audience is Augustus, named as Caesar 3 times in the work, the poem constitutes extended political trolling or even a metaphorical dissent from Augustan laws, morality, and politics. Alison Sherrock characterizes Ovid as not promoting adultery for its own sake, but offering, quote, an alternative to Augustine's social control, or to use that matrix metaphor, okay, a way out of that system of control. If the audience is other free, elite men, the lover is showing his competitors his techniques. If women gain access to his texts, they can recognize the lover's techniques and perhaps block them with the help of enslaved attendants or male relatives. In any case, the red pill readings of Ovid as an unironic pickup artist are missing a lot, both about the political context and about human behavior. Okay. On the lighter side, before getting into dark academia on Instagram, I first need to acknowledge my own attempts at creating an aesthetic. Here are some examples from my own Instagram page, which are mainly bright colors. Here's a bright yellow sunflower from late fall, and some tall pale green grass. Perhaps I unwittingly share in what philosopher Daniel Kaufman calls the good place phenomenon. I use brighter colors to suggest a more constructive attitude rather than the more restrictive palette of more nihilistic or pessimistic shows. But I want to emphasize here, with the right slide, what I have in common with the dark academia movement. I want to show that my suggestions come from someone sympathetic to the aesthetic rather than a grouchy kids these days rant. The image on the right features a quote-off between me and Lars the Etruscan about the ancient South Asian epic Mahabharata, which we were reading in class at the time. On the popular social media application Instagram, there are many accounts using the dark academia hashtag. Some of the common things labeled with this hashtag include enigmatic photos of older buildings or study nooks, references to classic literature, which basically means before World War I, or before World War II, okay. Yearnings to retreat from the world and read classic literature within the aforementioned study nooks, and ideally, the pursuit of learning and self-knowledge. But this talk will not simply describe the phenomenon, it will suggest ways that dark academia can be more of a way into the world and less of a way out of it. A way into writing and creativity and self-knowledge rather than an escape from it. Here's some examples from Instagram, and note the limited color palette, white, black, earth tones, especially sepia or dark red and green. The dominant clothing aesthetic is mid-20th century boarding school uniforms. Okay. Classic lines, but limited colors because of wartime shortages of fabrics and dyes. The film still on your left shows this aesthetic, even though the film is set in 1988, okay? The year I graduated from high school. Okay. But 1988 was also a peak of vintage nostalgia, and the year before, the film Dead Poets Society, another stylistic touchstone for the dark academia aesthetic, and it's set at a mid-century boarding school. Okay, the image on the right shows how the dark academia aesthetic can be monetized, like everything else under the sun. Okay, I want to talk about the buildings for a moment. I love the building images, since some of them I haven't seen before. My urban architecture antennae are usually up, and I taught architecture in a very introductory art history course at SPU for over a decade. My study of art history, though, would challenge the dark academics to think a bit more about these buildings, both artistically and socially. To what architectural movements do they belong? Who designed them? What's it like to walk through them? Or does the feature in the photo fit in with the overall design or not? Even a brief sentence nearby, such as, "I like this building facade because," would go a long way towards connecting a random image with the more coherent aesthetic. In fact, both these images could easily mention the work of art historical restoration that goes into maintaining the aesthetic. On the left, the residence in Würzburg was heavily damaged during World War II and then restored to what you see here in one of the biggest restoration projects in Europe. Similarly, on the right, Santa Croce in Florence has been repeatedly damaged by the flooding of the Arno River, then restored to what you see here. The books mentioned here discuss several restoration efforts, including building back from the 1966 flood. And the nave, I gotta say, looks way more awesome than a random statue next to the door. Next, I'm gonna talk about the nooks. We all need places to study where we can find the right degrees of comfort and focus, but this will vary a great deal by person. I wonder whether the principles of achieving a flow state or the much older monastic idea, go into your cell and it will teach you everything, will be helpful here. Not simply I want, or that looks like the best place for the activity of reading or creating, but I can get refuge from rain, sun, overstimulation, understimulation, catastrophe, pandemic, etc. The monk Richard Rollheiser, in his book, The Domestic Monastery, quotes St. John of the Cross, shown over here on the right. "But they, O my God and my life, will see and experience your mild touch, they who withdraw from the world and become mild, bringing the mild into harmony with the mild, thus enabling themselves to experience and enjoy you." Here I'm in more sympathy with the dark academia aesthetic. And note that the nooks actually do not need to be dark. Sunlight is a plus. Classic literature. The canon of dark academia on most days seems very limited, a list of maybe half a dozen books and films. On some days it seems as though half the posts are about the Great Gatsby or Romeo and Juliet. I don't want to slag either of these worthy books, but despite the humor of the conversation on the right, it's probably time to move on. Okay. Donna Tartt's Secret History appears frequently, but more as a hashtag than anything else. It's unclear whether the posters have even read this story of college students studying classics and worshiping the Greek god Dionysus with human sacrifice, which is really what it's about. Okay. Some of the books are featured more for their spines than for their content. For example, the books on the left slide are mostly geography books published in Europe in the 19th century CE, kind of artifacts of peak colonialism. The books on the right side are from the nicely affordable Penguin series, but you can't read half the titles, and what you can read is mostly from the 19th century and in English or translated into English. More adventurous posters branch out to poetry. On a really good day, you'll see things from Mahmoud Darwish, Louise Gluck, Anne Carson, Anna Akhmatova, or Pablo Neruda. More of that, please. Okay. Perhaps what bothers me more than the limited reading list is that some account owners seem to have stopped reading after high school. They want to create clever posts about literature, but they can't be bothered to read more of it. For me, literature is like a rope in freezing weather, running from the front porch of the farmhouse to the barn and to the outhouse. I read the novel Confederacy of Dunces because a celebrity whose name I have long since forgotten mentioned it in a Parade magazine interview. I read Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy because it was repeatedly mentioned in Confederacy of Dunces. If you like Gatsby, perhaps as a young adult rather than as a high school teen, follow up with Petronius' Satyricon, whose character Trimalchio is a possible model for Gatsby. But it's also much more savagely satirical about the morally corrosive effects of enormous wealth. Petronius outdoes Fitzgerald on the strength of a scene where a childless wealthy man has left his money to a group of parasites and fortune hunters. The catch is that if they want to inherit any of his fortune, they have to eat a proportional share of his corpse. How's that for dark? Okay. Or maybe what bothers me is that Latin textbooks appear as props. And again, certainly they would have been a feature of mid-century boarding schools, but the posts rarely move on to Latin literature, especially poetry, which is a large part of the point of reading, learning to read Latin. In other words, the textbooks are usually spine out, rarely open. And even though I work primarily on Latin prose, I want to affirm the value of Latin poetry, or even to say that it has more to offer dark academics. The romantic elements in Latin poetry are somewhat culturally specific, as we saw with Ovid, okay? And some of them make Victorian England look rather progressive. But the notes of yearning, the fantasies about another human soul, or the wish for things to be different and better are all there for the finding. I'm not claiming that Latin literature is the purest or the best place to find things that appeal to the dark academia aesthetic, only yet another place, especially for those who have gone to the trouble to learn Latin. Here's a sample from the Roman male poet Propertius. The notes of longing and wishing for things to be different is very congenial to the dark academia aesthetic, but he's not one of the A-list authors. Okay. Quote, "If all were to desire to pursue such a love life, and if all snuggled together and relaxed their limbs with the help of plenty of wine, there would be no cruel sword nor worship, nor would the sea near the battle of Actium splash over our bones." Some of these thoughts are pretty conventional. What the world needs now is love. Okay. The hypothetical language in the original and the wish for things to be different is very much in the spirit of dark academia. But I also want to highlight here what's historically particular. Rome had recently finished a century of wars, and in 31 BCE, Romans had killed Romans at the Battle of Actium, which the Emperor Augustus won. Propertius is sometimes considered obsessed with death and the dissolution of bodies. But in this case, it's hard to separate obsession from memory. Even though Propertius enjoyed the patronage of the Emperor Augustus and his circle, he mostly celebrated relationships over wars or laws. If first-person narrative is more your thing, or if you prefer Greek to Latin, here's a great piece usually attributed to the Greek female poet Sappho. Quote, "The moon has set, the Pleiades too. It is midnight, and the time is passing by, but I sleep alone." Again, we can recognize the feelings of loneliness and sleeplessness she invokes, and this poem is short and vivid enough, even for an Instagram post. But I need to add that Sappho was part of a vibrant poetic ecosystem now largely lost to us. And we know even less about her century, the early 6th century BCE, than when Propertius or Ovid lived. Even more than with Roman poetry, some of the nuances will remain out of reach. Here's a comment from one Instagram account quoting a scene from the movie Patterson about the difficulty of reading literature in translation from the Japanese poet that Patterson meets at the Falls. Quote, "Poetry in translation is like taking a shower with raincoat on." I'm not saying don't translate, but that there are things you will miss. There are things that cannot be incorporated. Some participants in dark academia acknowledge the Eurocentrism inherent in the aesthetic and solicit appropriate works by non-Anglophone and non-white authors or filmmakers, especially Japanese works. But the top works cited on Instagram remain British or American, even if the posters themselves are physically located in Italy or India. Another account includes a short video called Decolonizing Dark Academia, whose title is self-explanatory. This video may seem to eliminate all of dark academia because of its association with various colonial regimes, but the speaker specifically calls out admiration for the British Raj, the attempt by Britain to control the areas now known as India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And if you want to know why the Raj was bad, the short version is that they put Gandhi in jail for advocating Indian independence from Britain. Moreover, Lord Macaulay's 1835 memo, the Minute on Indian Education, forbade the teaching of Indian literature in British-controlled India. As an American, I have no love for British colonial regimes, even though some of the classics resources I use originated in the British Empire. I also do not want to idolize the British Raj, and the dark academics based in India want this even less. Here's a constructive example of applying the dark academia aesthetic outside of a Western context. The left one features an example of juxtaposing an ancient Sanskrit manuscript, I believe it's a copy of the Mahabharata, the great South Asian epic, a Mark Twain quote admiring India, and a modern Anglophone novel by the Indian author Arundhati Roy. The post is somewhat devoid of commentary, but at least the juxtaposition is not cliched. On the right, we see a Mughal period mosque, duly identified and featuring an actual human being in the space, a human being at prayer, with the label Muslim Dark Academia. Since the poster is based in South Asia, I read this not as a slur, but as an invitation to consider how the effects of light and darkness, or the dark academia aesthetic, might play out in the architecture of this Mughal mosque. Less positively, There's something post-traumatic about this aesthetic that makes people want to retreat. They have experienced at least failure, perhaps exclusion or prejudice or even violence. It's part of the aesthetic to feel the feels, but less so to write about seeking help from others or trying to get perspective on the situation. Here are a couple examples with a little bit of clarification. The left example seems like a classic self-defeating spiral. And the account owner in other posts suggested that he has avoided the self-defeating spiral of seeking academic success by academic failure, by dropping out of college. The right example depicts an example from Jenny Slate's recent memoir, Little Weirds, about her sinking into a pit of despair and rising back up. But the account owner helpfully adds a plea for empathy, since most people will not tell you that they are in a pit of despair. I'm also here to tell you that academic success does not magically solve the rest of your life. Okay. Empathy remains crucial. A great example of, I'd say, darkness in academia. M. Stuart Lewis, emerging from a years-long depressive episode, writes in his article, Acaddepressives, quote, "Indeed, I have real trouble loving some colleagues, but I am learning that one never knows the full picture of another's life, regardless of what staunch, work-obsessed academic persona that person seems to wish to cultivate. They too may be building pyramids against their own darkness and grief." End quote. This is a useful reminder, especially since social media tends to magnify the persona and minimize the person. Another example on the right, Mabalia Thomas, a professor in the School of Education at the University of Kansas, discusses her own experiences as a black woman in academia through the lens of Harry Potter, particularly the summoning of a metaphorical Patronus to protect her from all the soul-sucking, dementor-like forces trying to make her quit or to show her the door. The Patronus could be a colleague who's willing to speak up for her, especially when she's not in the room, or someone who navigated the same stresses that she did. Thomas specifically mentions Berea College professor Bell Hooks, now of blessed memory. Thomas emphasizes that this help is meant to respond to particular situations or needs, not to take away your own agency or efficacy. In other words, I want to encourage dark academics to do more empathizing and less wallowing. I would encourage dark academics to talk more about what helps them and not what drives them further down the pit. One other piece is that although reading can be therapeutic, you could not read your way out of mental health episodes, as M. Stuart Lewis would emphasize. The trick is the right book and the right dose. And I would advise reading a wide variety of books to see what effects they have on you, almost as a type of aesthetic experiment, as the philosopher David Hume recommends on The Standard of Taste. We know that some books make you happy, others make you sad, others fill you with longing. Others make you think about how fragile human life is or how resilient. But here's the thing, reading too much of one kind of book will unbalance you. And I need to read things other than what I study professionally, or else I will drown in despair. The library bingo offered by the Seattle Public Library is a good example of a way forward. Read books out of your comfort zone, read things to which you're not naturally drawn. Try something other than your usual reading diet. For example, pushed to read a book about summer, I read The Summer Book, a novella by Tove Jansson, better known for her Moomin Troll comics. No Moomins, but a good picture of the relationship between a young girl and her grandmother, or what summer feels like as a kid for whom everything is new. Also pushed by the library bingo, I read Octavia Butler's novel Kindred, which involves a black woman time traveling from contemporary Los Angeles to pre-Civil War Maryland, where she meets her ancestors, both enslaved and free. The novel is a pretty unflinching portrait of how race works in America, and Butler's a master prose stylist who keeps you in suspense till the end. In conclusion, I looked at student memes, red pill discourse, and the dark academia aesthetic. Memes are fun and edifying if you can add context, while red pill discourse is often a toxic misreading of ancient philosophy and literature. Dark academia aesthetic has some annoying features, but I feel that it's basically redemptive and capable of more constructive engagement with art, literature, and with the struggles of everyday life. Thank you. Sure. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Ewald. We're now going to go into our Q&A session. I heard the acoustics are really good in here, so you just have to stand and speak up. Yeah. Anyone has any questions? Yes.
What are some of your favorite lesser-known works of Latin Greek literature?
Thank you. So, I'd say that that's a great question. I'd say Propertius is on that list. Plautus, who does kind of Roman comedies. I used to teach him, but again, like I needed to basically, almost like every play needed an entire history lecture. So it was very difficult to teach. But again, I enjoy reading it. Let's see, maybe also, I also like some early Christian stuff too. Let's see, especially Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Macrina. Again, like Macrina Bakery up on the top of Queen Anne Hill is named for her. So, yeah, it's basically about his sister and how she, helped orphan girls and also managed to refute her brothers when they sort of went theologically astray, or how she called them back in. Yeah. And of course, a lot of the things, some of the things that I've shown here, again, are some of my favorites, or things that I've accidentally discovered. So, yeah. Exactly. Yes?
What, in regards to the dark academia aesthetic, what would you say are kind of the pros and cons of like the beautification of studying as both a motivator, but also maybe not quite as truthful to what being a student actually looks like?
Or I guess I'd say that you want to balance them. You want to show yourself making flashcards rather than with a closed book. Yeah. Right. Or I've also seen some great ones where people had a book open, but then also like their notebook. All the things that they scribbled down or all the arrows they drew. Yeah. So let's see. I think like a little more process and a little less product, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yes?
I'm not sure how to frame this. A picture's worth 1,000 words. There's a lot of serious study in classics, and someone with very little learning could create a meme that goes viral. Does that make you jealous like the Salieri? Do you enjoy it? How do you react from someone who's a serious student or,
Sure. I guess I'd say that not all of them are equally good. Sure. Or I'd say some of them miss the mark or reflect a common misunderstanding. But on the other hand, if somebody encapsulates, if somebody is able to say with a meme what I took 5,000 words to say, I'm grateful for that. And I'm sure others are too. I mean, that's a win. Yeah. Or I also am grateful for the ones that provoke further conversation. The ones that, this is a good kind of first approximation, but let's deepen that picture. Let's add some more context, okay? And let's see, and probably even some more, causes and consequences. Yeah. Isha.
I noticed that you do your own translating whenever you're quoting something. It seems almost no matter what language we're talking about. Do you find yourself frustrated with excellent scholarly translations, or is it just that you read the original and you translate on the fly? What's that like? Do you?
Okay, I think let's see. To one extent, there's just some dissatisfaction with existing translations, or even just like that they're in an English that's no longer spoken. So, let's by all means update that. The other thing is that, let's say that this is this is on YouTube, right? There's a portion of this that's on YouTube, and they're terrible about copyright. They're absolutely terrible. So if you if you use things from other people, that they might monetize it in really unhelpful ways, as they did with my opera lecture. And that was, so some of it is sort of the nuances of modern copyright as well. Yeah, I'd say it's also a challenge, I think you've done some literary translation, right? Yeah. So again, sort of challenge accepted for how to capture kind of the essentials. Yeah. Do I really understand it? Yeah. Yes.
So thanks for
Thank you, Michelle. Full disclosure, a colleague at the university once asked me what I would recommend as a dean reading, and I told her Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. So I'm a little biased here, but it seemed that one of the ways that was being misunderstood, the guilt of ignorance, that these people are ignorant of good and evil, I think actually isn't meant to inspire a kind of compassion. That it's not that people are freely choosing to do something harmful, but they simply don't know any better. And I think that's actually a sort of line you see throughout ancient ethics in various ways. I just wondered if you would agree with that.
Let's see. Perhaps it's not the only thing. I mean, I do have examples of where people did evil, out of knowledge. I mean, but.
I'm not saying whether or not that's an accurate understanding of human nature, but I do think that's the Stoic, part of the Stoic idea.
Sure.
Is that one can keep oneself from reacting angrily to other people's bad behavior by saying they're doing that under the description of the good as they understand it to be, right? And so it's ignorance, and so I should have compassion for their ignorance.
Sure, and I'd say that's also going back to Plato as well. The idea is people do, or people even he puts it even stronger way. People only do wrong through ignorance. Yeah, although I think your question also gets at what do you do with that sort of when you're on the receiving end, okay, or perhaps even especially like in traffic while commuting, right? Or how to react in, let's see, in a way that doesn't escalate things.
Right. And I think
Yeah.
that's part of the point, right? That I could let myself get really worked up about it.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Or even that Stoics write other things about the dangers of anger. Yeah. Or that often leads to various kinds of harm, that we didn't even necessarily intend. Okay. Yes?
I have two questions for you. One, you talked a lot about like this Redpill community and misappropriation of things. Do you see any real solution to that besides just adding context? And two, on a lighter note, how would you recommend finding new titles from areas that are by definition things you aren't necessarily interested in? Like where do you find your recommendations and you just kind of goes off the shelf?
Ooh, I'd say let me do the second one first, just because again, like following the rope. Let's say sometimes authors you like or essayists you like will recommend things even in passing. For instance, a guy writing, I think about the current state of English studies, recommended the Popol Vuh, the Mayan book of the community, and so I read that, because I liked this particular author. So it led me to a whole other area to which I wasn't familiar. Let's see. But as for the first one, that's pretty difficult. I mean, adding context is always a good idea, but. Let's see, but the Red Pill people will not necessarily even accept that, or because it's not from within their frame. I mean, like that's why the framing is so powerful, that or that things kind of only go through a narrow funnel, and stuff from outside it is automatically suspect, even if it's a fact. Yeah. Yeah, or I'd say too, Zuckerberg in her book wrestles with this issue. She says, I'm not going to convert these guys. He just acknowledges that. But I can publish this book, but I won't necessarily, I'm not going to make much headway against, let's see, red pill areas of Reddit. Yeah. Okay. Hannah.
Yeah, how have you seen the broader topics discussed today impact the classroom as a teaching environment and as a learning environment?
Let's see. Fortunately, I haven't seen too much red pill stuff. Yeah. Okay. Or let's see. Or even sometimes people who've heard of the meditations kind of through some other way. Like we can get into a better conversation about it, connect it to other parts of ancient philosophy, connect it to Stoicism, connect it to, or even the situation of the Roman Empire. I mean, let's see. I have seen a little bit of, I'd say, dark academia flavor in, let's say, in our discussions of the Iliad in a class that I'm teaching right now. Sure. Okay, or let me put it this way. My goal is to complicate the Achilles and Patroclus relationship rather than accept, ancient views, just friends, okay? Or, let's see, or views that are, or views that are kind of fan views, okay? But let's look at the text. Let's talk about it. Talk about various kinds of emotions that people have for each other. Yeah. Let's see. Oh, and maybe I'd say for the student memes. I mean, well, I bless those. Or that is usually they can either move the conversation along or have some insight, or at least give it to others. So yeah, I'm happy with those. Yeah. Right. Well, thank you all for coming. This is. I'm glad that that on-campus in-person events have resumed. Looking forward to the Weider lecture and many, many others.